April 30, 1945. The town of Weimar, Germany. A gray dawn creeps over a ruined street, shattered shop windows, empty trams, the stench of burnt timber. A single civilian 42-year-old schoolteacher Anna Muller stands trembling at the gate of the nearby camp, her eyes fixed on rows of skeletal figures behind barbed wire. The guards have just stepped aside. The U.S. tanks rumble and the first U.S. soldiers out of the half-track drop their helmets, dig in their eyes. Anna does not understand. She thought she was safe. She thought the war was someone else's. Now she sees. She hears the orders: German civilians, you must enter, you must look. Her breath catches the wire fence, the emaciated prisoners in striped uniforms, the ash-scattered remains of human lives. And in that moment the war she knew, the war she was told she understood, unravels beneath her feet. The Allies were not simply fighting armies, they were fighting for the unheard victims, the innocent beyond the front lines, the uncounted souls. By the spring of 1945 the war in Europe had entered its final act. The Western Allies and the Soviet forces advanced into Germany from west and east. The regime of Adolf Hitler, once unshakable, now trembled under relentless bombing, supply shortages, and the collapse of the Eastern Front. For years German civilians had lived under a wartime reality shaped by propaganda, rationing, fear of air raids, and the constant threat of mobilization. The skies above their towns were thick with Allied bombers, the countryside's factories churned for the war machine, yet in their daily routines, children to school if the school still stood, women to work, men at arms or missing, the true stakes were not always clear. Hitler's war had begun with a promise of defense and vengeance. For many civilians it was a war of duty, of fear, of endurance, but behind that facade lay a darker truth: millions of forced laborers, Jewish men, women and children, Roma and the disabled, all victimized by a regime that declared them expendable. The war the Allies fought was not only for territory or armies but for human dignity. As Allied forces crossed the Rhine, liberated the Belgian towns and pushed into the Ruhr, the German civilian population faced a new threat: the arrival of strangers in uniform, the collapse of Nazi control, and the revelation that the war they knew was not the war their government had described. The stakes for Germany were immense: defeat, occupation, restructuring and moral reckoning. And for the Allies the war was not simply to vanquish the Wehrmacht, it was to expose a system that had wrought unspeakable crimes. The civilians of Germany, until then spectators to war, were about to become witnesses. In early March 1945, as the Rhine River was breached and Allied armor rolled into the heart of the Reich, German civilians found themselves caught between collapsing front lines and the unknown. The Nazi propaganda machine had promised one thing: total victory, eternal glory and ultimate defense. In reality cities lay in ruins, transport collapsed, food was scarce and morale sank. Many civilians clung to the narrative of "we fight for the fatherland." They viewed the invading Allies as conquerors, not liberators. Yet across the front Allied soldiers reported surprise after entering German towns. They found well-furnished homes, neatly dressed children, rural landscapes that in places had been spared the bombing. Simultaneously the Allied air campaign, the strategic bombing of German cities, had both destroyed infrastructure and eroded the myth of invincibility. Almost one-third of the German population had been directly subjected to bombing and morale was deeply affected. In April, as Allied troops liberated the camps of Buchenwald and others, they issued an order: German civilians from the surrounding areas must be brought in to see what had happened in their name. The scene is set: a civilian population still believing they were the victims of war, an enemy army knocking at their doors, and the shocking truth of what their state had done. The war they lived in, the war they were defending, was not simply theirs. And now the moment of reckoning approached. May 4, 1945. The gates of Buchenwald open. German townfolk clad in war-worn coats walk past huddled figures. They see emaciated bodies, skeletons in striped uniforms, ash-gray bedding, the silent hollow eyes. A U.S. officer says, "You will see what your government hid." They are led through barracks, they touch the walls blackened by smoke, the stench of death still lingers. Mothers clutch children, fathers avert their eyes, some weep. The war took their sons, the war took their homes, but this was something else. They realized the enemy they were taught to hate was not the only victim. Their own nation had perpetrated horrors in their names under their roof. A farmer from Thuringia stands before a mass grave. He trembles, he asks, "Why did they not tell us?" The Allied translator says, "They did not believe you could bear it." Outside the camp the flags flap, the U.S. infantry walk past tanks. The liberation of Germany is underway, but for these civilians liberation feels different. It feels like forced memory. The war ends on paper on May 8, but for these women, men and children a different war begins, the war inside themselves. In the months that followed, German civilians entered a new world occupation rebuilding, reckoning the Allied forces found a population that, while defeated militarily, also had to confront a moral defeat. Many were stunned to learn that the war they believed they were fighting for was not simply theirs, it was for the voiceless, the enslaved, the murdered. The ruins of the towns, the emptied factories, the hollow homes all became symbols of something far greater, the collapse of a system that had promised security and pride yet delivered ruin and shame. Yet out of that wreckage arose resilience. Communities rebuilt, survivors told their stories, and a new Germany emerged, one that at last confronted the truth. Anna Muller returned to her school in Weimar. She taught history to children born in peace. She never spoke of the camp, but in her quiet voice she carried the memory. The Allies had fought not only armies but the silence behind them. German civilians, once prey and perpetrator, became witnesses, and by bearing witness they helped the world remember. May their awakening be the testament that even in defeat the unveiling of truth can become the seed of renewal. And so began the long years of silence and rebuilding. Across the occupied zone, cities became skeletons of their former selves. Dresden, Cologne, Hamburg, Berlin, each a landscape of ash and twisted steel. Families searched the rubble for names carved on doorframes, remnants of lives erased by firestorms. Children played with fragments of bombs, not knowing what they were. In every home stories diverged. Some spoke of survival, others of guilt, many simply turned inward. The Nuremberg trials began in November 1945, broadcast over radio waves that echoed through the ruins. Ordinary Germans gathered around static-filled speakers, hearing for the first time the voices of men who once ruled their world, the testimony of survivors, the photographs, the films shown in court stripped away the last illusions. The phrase "I did not know" became a burden that could no longer shield the conscience. The Allies did not seek only justice, they sought transformation. Denazification began with interrogations, with questionnaires, with the slow unraveling of ideology. Teachers, soldiers, mayors, clerks each asked the same questions. Were you a member? Did you know? Did you believe? For some it was humiliation, for others revelation, but for many it was the first time they confronted their reflection. In the East, under Soviet control, the message was different. The new Germany must be reborn through labor, through ideology, through obedience, while in the West the American, British and French zones began to rebuild through democracy, through openness, through memory. Yet in both halves the same shadow remained, the memory of what had been done and what had been ignored. Through the late 1940s, displaced persons wandered the roads. Millions of prisoners of war returned home to find strangers in their houses. Women carried families alone. Children grew in hunger, but also in the quiet strength that comes from endurance. In ruined churches, candles flickered before shattered altars. Priests spoke of forgiveness. Artists painted cities rising from rubble. Writers wrote of ghosts that walked the streets at night. By 1950, Germany was no longer a battlefield but a mirror. The people looked into it and saw fragments of pride and shame intertwined. The Allies who once marched in with rifles now offered bread, aid and lessons in freedom. The Marshall Plan rebuilt factories. The trains began to move again, and with them moved memories that refused to die. Anna Muller grew older, her hair turned gray, her hands trembled as she wrote on the blackboard. She spoke to her pupils about responsibility not as punishment but as duty. She told them history is not a weapon but a mirror that must never be covered again. Her students listened wide-eyed, their generation untouched by war but born from its ashes. Across Germany monuments began to rise, stones engraved with names of the lost, memorials built on sites once filled with silence. The people began to walk to these places not as tourists but as witnesses, each visit a small act of remembrance, each candle a quiet refusal to forget. And in time the world saw a different Germany, a nation that carried its guilt not as chains but as lessons carved in stone and conscience. The same streets that once echoed with marching boots now filled with the footsteps of children learning to build, not destroy. The story of those stunned civilians of Weimar, of Anna Muller and the countless others who looked upon the unspeakable, became the story of an awakening. They saw what their government had hidden, they faced what their silence had allowed, and from that moment the meaning of the Allied victory changed. It was not only the triumph of armies but the triumph of truth over denial. History remembers battles with numbers and dates, but history lives through eyes that saw and hearts that broke. The war ended in 1945, yet its echoes still move through generations, reminding us that the fight for humanity never ends. And as dusk falls once more over Weimar, the wind moves softly through the memorial trees planted where the camp once stood. Their leaves whisper a single vow: never again. Each year the seasons turned, and with them the memory deepened. The survivors grew fewer, their voices softer but their words heavier. In classrooms, in small town halls and rebuilt churches, their testimonies continued. They spoke not for vengeance but for remembrance, so that the young might understand that silence is never innocence. In the archives the photographs remained unchanged, the faces stared back from a world of smoke and hunger. Scholars studied them. Soldiers who had liberated the camps returned in old age to see what had become of the places they once entered with rifles and tears. Some stood in silence before memorial walls tracing the names of those they could never save. The new Germany born from division grew through struggle and doubt in the West. Democracy strengthened through debate and memory in the East. Ideology tightened its grip, yet beneath both systems the same moral current ran. The war had ended, but the reckoning had only begun. The wounds were not only in stone and soil but in memory and conscience. By the 1960s a new generation began to ask questions that their parents had feared to answer. They demanded to know what their fathers had done, where their mothers had been. They searched for records, for diaries, for photographs hidden in drawers. The nation trembled again, not from bombs but from truth confronting comfort. The trials of the past reopened, not in courtrooms but in families. Anna Muller, now retired, watched her students march in the streets, not for war but for peace. They carried signs calling for remembrance, for unity, for justice. She saw in them the reflection of a promise kept, that the children of the ruins would not become the children of hate. Across Europe nations rebuilt their monuments of sorrow. France, Poland, the Netherlands, each carrying the same quiet vow. The Allies who once fought in blood now worked in peace, building a continent that would not repeat the madness of its fathers. The iron borders that once divided enemies slowly opened to trade, to art, to shared memory. In 1989 the walls that separated East and West began to fall. People crossed the barriers not as conquerors but as brothers. They brought with them candles and songs and the hope that the past could at last rest in truth. The old generation watched in silence, knowing that what began in ruin had ended in renewal. Anna Muller passed away in that same year. She was buried beneath a small oak tree outside Weimar. Her former students came carrying white flowers. They did not speak of war, they spoke of what she taught them, that history is alive and demands courage to face it. A plaque near her grave bears her words, truth is the only victory that never fades. Now decades have passed. The camp near Weimar is a museum. The laughter of schoolchildren echoes where once there was silence. They walk among the barracks, guided by voices that tell them of suffering and of strength. They listen and write in their notebooks, eyes wide, hearts heavy, yet when they leave they walk into sunlight carrying the same quiet vow as those before them. The story of the stunned civilians has become part of the world's conscience. They were the eyes that saw the unthinkable and the hearts that began the long journey from denial to remembrance. The Allies fought with steel but won with truth, and through that truth the meaning of valor changed forever. Because valor is not only found on the battlefield but in the courage to face what one's own hands or silence have allowed. The resilience of a nation is not in its might but in its capacity to remember and rebuild. And so the voice of history continues, low, steady, eternal. It speaks through every memorial stone, every page of a diary, every whispered prayer in the ruins. It reminds the living that peace is not a gift but a responsibility. As the sun sets over the fields of Thuringia, the wind moves across the grass where graves lie unmarked. The sky burns gold then fades to gray. In that quiet hour the land seems to breathe again, carrying the memory of those who perished and those who finally saw. And in the fading light one truth remains clear: the Allies fought not to conquer a nation but to restore humanity itself. And the stunned hearts of Weimar became the witnesses who proved that even in the darkest night the human soul can still awaken. Night descends slowly over the hills of central Germany. The lights of towns glimmer faintly through mist, as if the earth itself is remembering what it has endured. The rivers that once carried the ashes of war now reflect the moon in stillness. Bridges rebuilt stand where explosions once roared. Trains glide quietly over them, carrying generations born long after the thunder ceased. In museums and memorials the silence is almost sacred. Visitors walk softly, their footsteps echoing on stone floors. Each display tells fragments of the same vast story, letters written in trembling hands, uniforms faded with time, children's shoes placed behind glass. Each object speaks of both horror and endurance, of destruction and the will to live. The historians who study these remnants understand that memory is not a straight path. It bends, it falters, it hides and returns. Like the smoke that once rose from the camps, it drifts but never disappears. They write not to reopen wounds but to keep truth from vanishing into comfort and forgetfulness, for they know that every generation must choose to remember or to repeat. Across the ocean the soldiers who liberated the camps grew old. Their medals gathered dust, their stories softened in family memories. Yet sometimes at night they awoke from dreams of the same faces, the same silence. They had seen victory but also the price of it. Some wrote memoirs, others said nothing, but in each of them lingered the same realization that the war they fought had saved not only lives but the conscience of humanity itself. In the decades that followed, Germany became a nation of remembrance. Memorial days, museums, school lessons all spoke in one voice, never again. The phrase was simple yet carried the weight of millions of vanished lives. It became more than a warning, it became a foundation for peace. The children of the stunned civilians now taught their own children what had happened, not with hatred but with resolve. Time moved forward but history remained alive. In 2005 the world gathered to mark 60 years since the end of the war. Survivors stood beside soldiers, diplomats beside schoolchildren. Candles were lit at Buchenwald, at Auschwitz, at Bergen-Belsen, and at sites once forgotten. The flames flickered against the evening wind, each one a fragile yet defiant spark of remembrance. Among those attending was a young girl from Weimar carrying a photograph of her grandmother Anna Muller. She placed it beneath the memorial oak and whispered words only she could hear. She thanked her for teaching truth, for facing what others turned from, and for proving that compassion could grow from the ashes of guilt. As the ceremony ended, the crowd remained still. The wind moved through the trees, and for a moment it felt as if the voices of the lost answered not in sorrow but in peace. The sound was faint, like a heartbeat across generations. In the years since, the lessons of that time continue to echo in every corner of the world. Whenever tyranny rises, whenever lies seek to bury truth, the memory of those stunned faces returns, a reminder that indifference is the seed of tragedy and awareness its only cure. The story of Weimar is no longer confined to Germany. It belongs to all who have faced the dark and chosen light. It speaks to soldiers who fight for justice, to teachers who guard memory, to children who learn empathy through history. It whispers that courage is not always found in the roar of battle but often in the quiet act of looking and refusing to turn away. And when the last witness is gone, when the last survivor's voice has faded into the air, their memory will remain in the stones, the soil, and the souls of those who remember. For history is not a ghost, it is a living breath moving through time. As dawn returns once more over the hills, the world awakens to another day of peace. Fragile yet precious, the wind carries distant echoes of the past but also a promise that the world has learned, even if imperfectly, that truth endures and that remembrance is the truest form of valor. And so the story ends, not with silence but with a heartbeat, steady, calm, eternal, reminding every generation that from the stunned eyes of Weimar came the greatest lesson of all, that humanity must never close its eyes again.